Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm Maria, your host for today on the Brain Talk podcast. Welcome to our second episode of our podcast. In the Brain Talk, we discuss various mental health and neuroscience topics, exploring them in depth and from a scientific perspective. Today, we will discuss cognitive neuroscience, focusing on how neurotransmitters, brain regions, genetics, neural plasticity, and our environment shape how our cognitive abilities interact. We'll also explore psychology and neuroscience and how they can bridge together. Let's introduce our special guest, a third-year medical student, Fatima. Please introduce yourself and tell us about you.
Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm Fatima, a third year medical student at Al-Faisal University. And thank you so much for having me here for the podcast.
Thank you so much for coming to our podcast. So, can I discuss? So tell us about what we're going to talk about, neurotransmitters. What are they?
So neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that basically transmit signals across a chemical synapse. Now, synapses could be present between two neurons or a neuron and a muscle cell. The process of synaptic transmission itself involves several key steps. Now, I'll go briefly over them. We have synthesis and storage. Now, neurotransmitters are synthesized from precursor molecules and stored in something called the synaptic vesicles within the synaptic neuron. Then they're released when there is a action potential and influx of calcium ions. And they fuse with the presynaptic membrane, causing them to be released into the synaptic cleft. Then these neurotransmitters basically diffuse across the synaptic cleft and they bind to receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. And this binding causes various effects depending on the type of neurotransmitter that is involved. Now, they could be excitatory or inhibitory. Excitatory like glutamate and inhibitory like GABA. And the action of neurotransmitters can then be terminated by different mechanisms. This could be reuptake of the neurotransmitter into the presynaptic neuron, or they could be degraded by enzymes, and they could diffuse away from the synaptic cleft. Now, obviously, neurotransmitters, each of them have a different role and how their role plays in cognitive neuroscience. So glutamate is a primary excitatory neurotransmitter in the CNS. Then we have GABA, which is gamma aminobutyric acid, and it is inhibitory neurotransmitter. Then we have some of the ones that are very well known: dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, and norepinephrine. Dopamine is involved in reward, motivation, and motor control. Serotonin in mood regulation, sleep, and appetite. Then we have acetylcholine, which is involved in muscle activation, attention, and learning. And norepinephrine in arousal, alertness, and flight or fight response. So that's about neurotransmitters.
Can they affect our mood and behaviors, and how do they? Is there a certain type that can, or is just all neurotransmitters can?
Yes, they can affect your mood and behavior. Like, for example, dopamine, it gives us a lot of pleasure. Yeah. And serotonin is again involved in mood regulation, helps you sleep, and improves your appetite. Then we have norepinephrine, which again keeps you alert, arouses, and is present in the flight or fight response. So yeah, they could all be present in different kinds of emotions, moods.
When we think of emotions and moods, not to reference the Inside Out movie, but how do we store memories? Is it like in little balls, we put them in storage, or how do we really?
Okay, memory basically is stored. Now, let's say you're learning something new, yeah?
Yeah.
And when you learn something new, there are a lot of changes and processes that go through in your brain. So one important thing is called neuroplasticity. Now, obviously, there are two types of it. There are structural changes and functional changes. So the structural ones, the brain's physical structure changes as we learn. There are new synapses, basically connections between neurons that form, and existing ones become strengthened or weakened. This is called synaptic plasticity. Then we have functional changes. So basically, the efficiency of your neural pathways can improve. The more a pathway is used, the more efficient it becomes at transmitting the signals, which is why repetition and practice is very important when we learn. We hear spaced repetition, active learning. That's mostly because of improving neuroplasticity.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have long-term potentiation. Now, this is a process that strengthens the synapses between neurons. It basically involves an increase in the synaptic strength following a high-frequency stimulation of a synapse. Then we have something called the neurogenesis. Now, in some areas of the brain, such as the hippocampus, new neurons can be created in a process called neurogenesis, and these new neurons can integrate into the present or existing circuits and contribute to learning and memory formation. Obviously, the brain chemistry changes when we learn because of the levels of various neurotransmitters that are present, such as dopamine, which again plays a key role in motivation, reward, and acetylcholine, which is involved in attention and learning. Then we have engagement of multiple brain regions at the same time. For example, the hippocampus, that's basically where new memories form. The prefrontal cortex is basically involved in planning, decision making, and cerebellum in motor learning. Now,
Mm-hmm.
how does this memory form is the short-term and the long-term memories. The short-term memories are initially stored in the prefrontal cortex, while long-term memories are consolidated and stored in various parts of the brain, including the hippocampus and the neocortex. Again, since we spoke about memory a bit, I'll talk about attention and focus. Effective learning basically needs you to have more focus and attention, yeah? Now, this involves the activation of something called the prefrontal cortex. Any disruptions or distractions can basically cause the disruptions in the prefrontal cortex and decrease your attention, making you not learn effectively. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's about learning and memory.
When you think of like memory and learning, I feel like the youth always say my attention span is so low because of TikTok, YouTube, or just content. What's your opinion on that? And do you think technology and constant screen time can impact our brain development and how we function?
Honestly, yes. I've gone from watching YouTube videos, like 20-minute long videos, and now I barely can watch or go past through the 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
The first minute should always be eye-catching, or I can't go past through it.
Mm.
And I think it's one of the main reasons of using TikTok and Reels, but it's something we use every single day and not something we could just, shut down. I mean, we could if we go on a digital detox and stuff, but then we use it on an everyday basis, and it definitely does reduce your attention span. For
Mm.
me, if something isn't going to be eye-catching or captivate my attention in 1 minute, there is literally no way you're going to have my focus.
Yeah, I really agree with you. So, how do we like improve that attention span? Is it watch longer videos, spend more time outside of phones entirely, or?
Not completely spend time outside your phones, obviously. They say
Mm-hmm.
reduce distractions and stuff like that. But to improve your attention span, I'd say start with watching your lecture recordings themselves. Like if you're
Ah.
a watch the
Mm-hmm.
recording. I'm not sure if all the lectures get recorded, but in my university, they do. So
Mm-hmm.
I watch the recordings. I pause whenever needed if I need a break, and I take my own notes, and that helps me bring my attention back. I break down the entire 1 hour lecture into 15-minute segments so I can maintain my attention throughout. And every single time I study, I make sure I keep my mobile away, no distractions, because I know every minute I feel tired and disrupted. I feel the need to go back on Instagram and watch all the reels. So, no distractions. And one more thing that is very important for attention is sleep.
Mm-hmm.
If your sleep is really good, the quality and how long you sleep, if that is really good, then you'll have a better learning and memory, especially because during sleep, there is REM and deep sleep stages, yeah? So the brain processes and information that are learned during the day are strengthened during the night while you sleep. Like the neural connections actually become
Mm-hmm.
stronger. So you
Oh.
have to sleep better in order to have a better attention during class or while you're studying.
Mm-hmm. So attention span can also be affected by your sleep. I think people, they tend to kind of spam studying. But I think I realized that you use the Pomodoro technique when you mentioned the 15-minute breaks. Was that what it?
Yeah. The Pomodoro
Mm.
techniques are really helpful.
How so?
Then, I'm sorry for interrupting, but then
Mm-hmm.
what I noticed is sometimes you're really in the mood to study and you're using Pomodoro. Like,
Mm-hmm.
let's say you spent 20 minutes studying and you know there's a 5-minute break coming up,
Mm-hmm.
but then you're so deep into it, if you break it off, then it's really hard to get back your attention.
Mm-hmm.
So in those cases, what I do is I don't follow the Pomodoro technique. I keep going as long as I could keep my attention span. And then
Mm-hmm.
I take.
Mm-hmm. So, how can the lack of sleep affect our brain and our cognitive functions then?
So, as someone who pulled all-nighters in my first year, I absolutely hated it. It could ruin your grades so bad. Like
Mm,
you could like actually be a student who is capable of getting A stars and still, because of the lack of sleep, completely have a blurred brain or mind while you're doing the exam and still end up getting a B or a C.
mm,
Like, the moment I started improving my sleep schedule and sleep cycle, grades improved so much. So, sleep basically, again, as I said, what it does is when you sleep, the REM and the sleep stages, yeah, what happens is it strengthens the neural circuits that are already present, which improves your memory. So, good sleep quality is very important.
Yeah. What about stress and anxiety? How can they affect our brain and our cognitive abilities?
So, obviously, stress and anxiety is something that gets triggered from what we call the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is a part of the brain that is involved in emotional regulation, especially fear, pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever something, let's say a snake, just an example, you see a snake, the first thing that gets activated is your amygdala. If it is pleasure, then you're fine. But if it is fear, your flight or fight response gets activated. So that's basically how you have stress and anxiety, which is not really good for a person who studies a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But to be honest, I am stressed and anxious 24/7.
Mm,
So how I personally get over it is, how could you overcome your anxiety if you do not study?
mm,
Like anxious about your grades at the end of the day.
mm,
So of course the only option is you study for it.
mm-hmm.
That's the only, it's basically your mindset that makes you keep going sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Do you think like notions and little reminders can help you? I think people used to really believe in at some point, daily reminders, like, oh, I'm smart enough, oh, I'm good enough. Do you think that affects how stressful you are? Or do you believe in those to begin with?
So reminders, yes, sometimes. My personal reminder is my mom. I
Hmm.
love calling her throughout the, and I tell her whatever I'm going through, and she'll be like, you know, you could do it. You know your best version. You know the potential you have.
Hmm.
So you work towards being your best potential version you have. You know.
Mm-hmm.
So such reminders from either people you love the most, or of course the reminders you get on mobile, it
Hmm.
works.
Ah, okay. And in what way do like our experiences and our environment shape development of our brains? Like when we grow up, does our brain necessarily change as we grow?
It does. Now, experience and environment very much influences the development and functioning of our brain
Mm-hmm.
through various mechanisms. Now, again, we have neuroplasticity in this place. Again, we have critical periods. Now, this is basically sensitive periods or periods of development when the brain is very receptive to certain environmental stimuli. It could be language acquisition or your visual development. And certain skills and abilities must be acquired during specific periods. You know, during child growth, they
Mm-hmm.
have these critical periods. Otherwise, they may never really develop. For example, vision can be permanently impaired if a child is deprived of any visual stimuli during their childhood. Of course, environment plays a great role. Now, if you're getting exposed to a certain stimuli in the environment
Mm-hmm.
with various and new experiences, now this could enhance your cognitive function and promote your brain health. Let's
Mm-hmm.
say there's a deprivation of them. In cases of extreme neglect, It could lead to cognitive deficits and it could hinder your brain development. Then we have, again, stress and trauma. Prolonged exposure to stress can change brain structures and function, particularly in the areas that involve emotional regulation and memory. That is the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. And any trauma can have a long-lasting effect on the brain. You know how people have PTSD?
Yeah.
Now, this is basically the brain's response to trauma, and this involves multiple changes in the neural circuits and stress hormone regulation. And then we have social interactions. Let's say that you're interacting with others, and this allows you to learn from observation and imitation. Now, this could again change your neural pathways involved in social behavior and communication. Then, early attachment experiences, especially with your primary caregivers, which is your parents at most times, this could influence the development of your neural systems related to emotion regulation and social behavior. They say that if your relationship with your primary caregiver, mostly the mother, if it isn't that good enough, you're going to have attachment issues when you grow up. Then we have exercise. Again, physical activity is equal to more neurogenesis, that is the formation of new neurons. And for the new neurons, we have better cognitive function in the hippocampus, which is very important for learning and memory. Then diet, nutrition. Let's say someone who takes really good care, has a good balanced diet, they will have a better brain development. Any nutritional deficiencies could impair cognitive abilities and overall cultural practices. Your cultural environment shapes the way you process information, such as language, values, social norms. You know how you go to different places and you have culture shock? Now, it is something due to how your cultural practice shapes your brain processing information. And you have education and how you've been trained. This could improve different cognitive skills and expertise. Again, this is reflected on your brain structure and function. So, yeah.
Speaking of the part of the brains, how does the prefrontal cortex play a role in decision making and self control?
Okay, so the prefrontal cortex is very important in decision making and self control. It is involved in higher order cognitive processes called executive functions. These include planning, organizing, problem solving, strategizing. It helps in evaluating different options and making decisions based on your goals and what outcomes or consequences you expect. And then when it comes to impulse control, it also delays gratification. It helps individuals basically control their desires and behaviors in favor for any longer.
Speaking of like genetics and your mother, anyone's mothers or their caregivers in their family, how do genetics influence our cognitive abilities and our personality traits? Because I feel like people say, oh, I got this from my mom, this from my dad. Does it also affect your cognitive abilities?
It does. Not just cognitive abilities, but also your personality traits. Now, there is heritability. Studies mostly say that around 50 to 80% of your genetic factors account for your IQ. Then we have polygenetic influence, that is basically multiple genes that influence on your cognitive abilities. Then we have the genes interacting with your environment. While it's not just only genes, your environment also plays a role in your cognitive abilities, yeah? So such as factors, as I said, education, your socioeconomic status, your nutrition, everything else could play a very important role since your genes interact with them. Then we have the neurobiological pathways. Now, genes influence cognitive abilities by affecting brain development and function, yeah? For example, the genes involved in neurogenesis, synaptic plasticity, the ones involved in neurotransmitter systems. They have all been linked together with cognitive functions and IQ.
Okay, I think that's all we have to say. Thank you so much for your time and this great discussion we have.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone for joining us today. That concludes our discussion on cognitive neuroscience. I hope everyone found this episode beneficial or learned something new. See you in the next episode of The Brain Talk. Thank you.